The Valorian Empire had ruled the stars for over 1,000 years. They had conquered 17 star systems. They had crushed hundreds of species under their boots. No one had ever stopped them. No one had ever even tried to fight back. The Valorians believed they were the most powerful beings in the universe, and for a very long time, they were right. High Commander Zorath stood on the bridge of his flagship, the Eternal Dominion. He was tall and thin, with gray skin and 4 eyes that glowed a soft yellow. He had led more than 50 planetary invasions in his long career. Every single one had ended the same way. The enemy would see his fleet, they would tremble, and they would surrender. It was simple. It was easy. It was boring. But today would be different. Today, his long-range sensors had found a new world. A small blue planet orbiting a yellow star at the edge of the galaxy. The planet was called Earth by its inhabitants. The inhabitants called themselves humans. Zorath studied the data on his screen. The humans were primitive. They had only recently discovered space travel. Their fastest ships could barely leave their own solar system. Their weapons were chemical and nuclear, ancient technology that the Valorians had abandoned centuries ago. Their population was large, nearly 8 billion. But they were divided into hundreds of nations that constantly fought each other. This would be the easiest conquest of his career. He gave the order, and 300 Valorian warships jumped into hyperspace. They emerged above Earth on a quiet Tuesday morning in late October. The massive ships blocked out the sun over half the planet. Satellites went dark. Communication systems screamed with static. Every human on Earth looked up at the sky and saw the same thing. They were not alone in the universe. And the universe had come for them. Zorath broadcast a standard ultimatum. His voice echoed from every radio, every television, every phone on the planet. The message was simple. Surrender within 1 planetary rotation or face complete destruction. Resistance was pointless. The Valorian Empire was merciful to those who submitted. Those who fought would be erased from existence. He expected the humans to panic. He expected them to beg. He expected their leaders to contact him within the hour, offering anything in exchange for their lives. He was wrong. In Washington. General Jake Morrison stood in the war room beneath the White House. He was 62 years old, with gray hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from stone. He had served in 3 wars. He had buried friends on 4 continents. He had never lost a battle he was meant to win, and he had never surrendered a battle he was meant to lose. Beside him stood Dr. Katie Langston. She was 38, with dark hair pulled back in a messy ponytail and glasses that she kept pushing up her nose. She was the best language expert in the country. Within minutes of receiving the alien transmission, she was already working to decode their language. The president entered the room. He was a young man, barely 50, and his face was pale with fear. But his voice was steady when he spoke. "What are our options?" he asked. Morrison looked at the satellite images showing the alien fleet. 300 ships, each one larger than an aircraft carrier. Weapons that could burn cities to ash in seconds. Shields that could stop nuclear missiles like they were paper airplanes. "We cannot win a direct fight," Morrison said. "Not yet. But we can prepare. We can learn. And we can make them bleed for every inch of ground they try to take." The president nodded slowly. "Do not fire first, but prepare everything we have." Within hours, something happened that had never happened before in human history. The world united. Old enemies set aside their hatred. Russian generals spoke directly with American commanders. Chinese admirals coordinated with European defense ministers. Indian scientists shared their research with Pakistani engineers. Every military force on the planet was mobilized. Every weapon was loaded. Every soldier was ready. The Valorians watched from orbit. They found it amusing. These primitive creatures were organizing their pathetic defenses. They were gathering their ancient weapons. They were preparing to fight an enemy they could not possibly defeat. Zorth laughed when he saw the reports. "They are like insects," he said to his officers. "They do not understand that we could crush them with a single thought. Perhaps a demonstration will help them see reason." He gave humanity 6 hours to surrender. The deadline came and went. No human leader contacted him. No white flags were raised. No surrender was offered. Zorth was surprised, but not concerned. He had seen this before. Some species needed to see the fire before they feared it. He chose a target. A large city on the coast of a landmass called North America. The city was called Houston. It had millions of inhabitants. It would make an excellent example. The order was given. A single Valorian destroyer moved into position. Its plasma cannons charged with a low hum that could be heard in space. And then it fired. The beam of light that struck Houston was brighter than the sun. It lasted for exactly 3 minutes. When it ended, downtown Houston no longer existed. Millions of people were gone in an instant. Buildings that had stood for 100 years were reduced to ash. The heat was so intense that the bay itself began to boil. The footage spread across the world in seconds. Every screen on the planet showed the same horror. The mushroom cloud rising over the ruins. The silence where a city used to be. The death of millions in the blink of an eye. Zorth waited for the surrender to come. He was certain it would come now. No species could witness such destruction and continue to resist. It was impossible. It was unthinkable. He waited and waited and then his communication officer turned to him with a strange expression on her face. "High Commander," she said. "We are receiving a transmission from the planet's surface." Zorth smiled. Finally, the humans had come to their senses. "Put it through." General Morrison appeared on the screen. His face was not afraid. His eyes were not begging. He looked at the alien commander with an expression that Zorth had never seen before on any species in any star system. It was cold. Pure rage. Morrison spoke only 4 words. "You should not have done that." Then the transmission ended. Zorth stared at the blank screen. For the first time in his very long career, he felt something strange in his chest. It took him a moment to recognize it. It was doubt. What kind of species responds to the death of millions not with surrender, but with a threat? He would soon find out. High Commander Zorth made a decision that would change everything. If the humans would not surrender from orbit, his soldiers would break them on the ground. He ordered a full invasion. 20,000 Valorian shock troops descended upon Earth in drop pods. They fell from the sky like metal rain, crashing into military bases and cities across the planet. Each soldier was 8 feet tall, covered in armor that could stop bullets, and armed with plasma rifles that could burn through steel. The Valorians had conquered hundreds of worlds using these same tactics. They would land, they would kill, and the enemy would break. It always worked. It had never failed. They expected terrified civilians running through the streets. They expected soldiers throwing down their weapons and begging for mercy. They expected easy victory. They found something else entirely. In the ruins of Houston, a man named Danny Ortega had spent the last 3 days preparing. He was 45 years old, a former high school football coach with thick arms and a face weathered by the Texas sun. His wife had died in the attack. His daughter had died in the attack. His entire world had been burned to ash in 3 minutes. He should have been broken. He should have been hiding in some basement, waiting for death. Instead, he was loading ammunition. Danny had gathered 43 survivors from the ruins. Old men who remembered hunting with their fathers. Young women who had never held a gun before. Teenagers who should have been worrying about homework. None of them were soldiers. All of them were angry. They had hunting rifles and shotguns. They had gasoline and fertilizer. They had homemade explosives built from instructions found on the internet. They had no training, no support, and no chance of survival. But they had something the Valorians did not understand. They had absolutely nothing left to lose. When the first Valorian patrol entered the destroyed city, they were not expecting an ambush. Their scanners showed 43 life signs scattered across the ruins. 43 primitives with ancient weapons. It would take 10 minutes to eliminate them. The patrol walked into a trap that had been set by a football coach who had spent 20 years teaching boys how to anticipate their opponents. The first explosion took out their lead vehicle. The second blocked their retreat. And then Danny Ortega and his people opened fire from every direction at once. The Valorians had energy shields that could stop bullets. But the shields had a weakness. They could only block attacks from one direction at a time. When you were being shot from everywhere at once, the shields could not protect you. The battle lasted 4 hours. Danny Ortega died in the 3rd hour, charging a Valorian position with a shotgun in one hand and a grenade in the other. 31 of his people died with him. But when the sun rose over the ruins of Houston, 98 Valorian soldiers lay dead in the streets. Got the footage spread across the world within hours. It showed ordinary people fighting monsters. It showed a football coach killing alien warriors. It showed humans dying, yes, but dying on their feet, with weapons in their hands and defiance in their eyes. Similar stories came from every continent in the mountains of Afghanistan. Warriors who had spent generations fighting invaders turned their ancient skills against a new enemy. They knew the rocks. They knew the caves. They knew how to disappear into shadows and strike from nowhere. The Valorians called these mountains the Devil's Teeth. They lost 300 soldiers in the first week in the jungles of Vietnam. Old men who remembered older wars taught the young how to fight. They built traps from bamboo and rope. They dug tunnels that went for miles underground. They turned the jungle itself into a weapon. The Valorians learned to fear the trees in the frozen wastes of Russia. The winter became an ally. The Valorians came from a warm planet. They had never experienced cold like this. Their equipment froze. Their soldiers weakened. And while they struggled against the ice, Russian fighters hunted them like wolves hunting sick deer. Dr. Katie Langston continued to intercept Valorian communications from her bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains. What she heard made her smile for the first time in weeks. The aliens were afraid. Their casualty reports were unlike anything in their history. They were losing soldiers at a rate that should have been impossible. These humans did not fight like any species they had conquered before. They did not surrender when they were outnumbered. They did not run when they were outgunned. They fought until they died, and even in death, they found ways to take Valorians with them. One Valorian commander sent a desperate message to the fleet. These creatures are insane. They strap explosives to their chests and run at our positions. They use their own bodies as weapons. They die laughing. How do you fight an enemy who's not afraid to die? General Morrison authorized Operation Blackout. It was simple. No more big battles. No more standing armies. Every human on Earth would become a soldier. Every city would become a fortress. Every street would become a killing ground. For 3 weeks, the Earth became a nightmare. A grandmother in Ohio poisoned a Valorian patrol by putting cleaning chemicals in a water supply she knew they would drink from. A teenager in Brazil used a drone built for photography to drop homemade explosives on an alien camp. A group of engineers in Japan hacked into Valorian communication systems and sent fake orders that led enemy patrols into ambushes. The Valorians had superior technology. They had better weapons. They had shields and armor and centuries of combat experience. Humanity had 10,000 years of practice at killing each other. Every weapon ever invented by humans was turned against the invaders. Diseases and poisons that had been banned by international law were unleashed without mercy. Traps that would have been considered war crimes in any human conflict became standard tactics. The rules of civilized warfare were thrown away, because this was not civilized warfare. This was survival. High Commander Zorath watched the casualty reports climb higher and higher. 2,000 soldiers dead. Then 5,000. Then 10,000. His officers began to whisper. They had never lost a ground campaign. They had never faced an enemy who refused to break. They began to wonder if they had made a terrible mistake. Zora silenced the whispers with a single command. "We will burn them all," he said. "If they will not submit, they will be erased. Prepare the planet-killer weapons." The order went out to the fleet. The massive weapons began to charge. Soon they would have enough power to turn the surface of Earth into molten glass. But across the planet, humanity did not know about this order. They only knew that they were still fighting. They only knew that they were still alive. And somewhere in the Rocky Mountains, a young programmer named Ben Crawford was working on something that might change everything. He had captured a crashed Valorian shuttle. He had studied its engines. And he had discovered something that made his heart pound with hope. It was possible to send a message to the stars. The question was, would anyone answer? The world had exactly 12 hours to mourn Houston. 12 hours to cry, to scream, to feel the weight of millions of lost lives pressing down on their hearts. And then the mourning stopped, and something else took its place. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Price was on the deck of the USS Theodore Roosevelt when Houston burned. The aircraft carrier was stationed in the Gulf of Mexico, close enough that he could see the glow on the horizon, close enough that he could feel the heat on his face, even from 100 miles away. He watched the mushroom cloud rise into the sky. He watched it spread like a poisonous flower blooming over the grave of a city. And something inside him changed. Ryan Price had been in the Navy for 15 years. He had seen combat. He had lost friends. He had done his duty and followed his orders and never questioned his purpose. But standing on that deck, watching an alien weapon erase millions of his countrymen from existence, he felt something ancient wake up inside him. It was not fear. It was not despair. It was anger. Pure, clean, burning anger. He looked around and saw the same expression on every face. The sailors, the pilots, the mechanics and cooks and doctors. Every single person on that ship had the same look in their eyes. The same fire. The same silent promise. This was not over. This was just beginning. In the bunker beneath the Rocky Mountains, Dr. Katie Langston worked without sleep. She had been studying the alien language for 36 hours straight. Her eyes were red. Her hands were shaking from too much coffee. But she did not stop. She could not stop. The aliens communicated using a complex system of frequencies and tones. It had taken her team hours just to figure out the basic structure. But now she was starting to understand. Now she was starting to see patterns, and what she saw gave her hope. She rushed to General Morrison with her findings. The aliens were confident. Too confident. Their communications were not encrypted. Their battle plans were broadcast openly, because they did not believe any primitive species could possibly understand them. They were wrong. Working beside her was a young programmer named Ben Crawford. He was 26 years old, with messy brown hair and a t-shirt that had not been changed in 3 days. He had been a software engineer before the invasion. Now he was something else. Now he was a weapon. Ben had studied the alien transmissions and found something crucial. The Valorian shields operated on a specific energy frequency. If that frequency could be disrupted, even for a few seconds, the shields would fail. The theory was simple. Building the device was not. Ben and his team worked around the clock. They used parts from cell phones and satellites and military equipment. They tested and failed and tested again. Engineers from a dozen countries sent ideas and designs through secure channels. The whole world was working together on a single problem. Finally, after 48 hours without sleep, Ben Crawford held up a small metal box. It looked like something a child might build in a garage. It was ugly and rough and covered in wires. It was also the most important weapon humanity had ever created. General Morrison authorized the first test. A single modified cruise missile carrying Ben's frequency jammer was launched at a Valorian destroyer orbiting over the Atlantic Ocean. The missile flew through a storm of plasma fire. Valorian defense systems tried to shoot it down. Most of the decoy missiles were destroyed instantly. But the real missile kept going. It was small. It was fast. It was built with human stubbornness and human rage. It struck the destroyer and activated the jammer. For exactly 11 seconds. The Valorian shields failed. Captain Samantha Reyes was waiting for those 11 seconds. She was 34 years old, a fighter pilot with 10 years of experience. She had been flying since she was 16. She had never lost a dogfight. And she had never been more ready for anything in her life. Her squadron had been circling at high altitude, waiting for the signal. When the shields dropped, she pushed her throttle forward and screamed into her radio. "All wings, attack now." 12 fighter jets dove toward the Valorian destroyer. They fired everything they had: missiles, cannons, every piece of ammunition they carried. The explosions lit up the night sky like fireworks. When the smoke cleared, the Valorian destroyer was falling. Its engines were dead. Its hull was broken. It tumbled from orbit and crashed into the Atlantic Ocean with an impact that created waves 100 feet high. Samantha Reyes watched it fall. Her hands were shaking on the controls. Her heart was pounding in her chest. She had just done the impossible. She had destroyed an alien warship. Aboard the Eternal Dominion, High Commander Zorath received a report with disbelief. A destroyer, one of his destroyers, destroyed by primitives with chemical rockets and metal airplanes. It was impossible. It was unthinkable, but it had happened. His officers looked at him with uncertain eyes. For the first time, they were afraid. Not of the humans. Not yet. But of what this meant. If these creatures could destroy one ship, they could destroy others. If they could learn to fight back, they could become a threat. Zorath crushed his doubt beneath his pride. One ship meant nothing. He had 300 more. These humans had gotten lucky. It would not happen again. But across the planet, humanity had seen the footage. They had watched the alien ship fall from the sky. They had seen proof that these invaders could be hurt, could be stopped, could be killed. The effect was electric. Factories that had been converted to build jammers doubled their production. Engineers who had been sleeping sat up and returned to work. Soldiers who had been afraid suddenly found their courage. In Moscow, Russian scientists began modifying nuclear missiles to carry frequency jammers. In Beijing, Chinese engineers designed new guidance systems that could evade alien defenses. In London, British programmers wrote targeting software that could coordinate attacks from around the globe. The world was no longer waiting to die. The world was preparing to fight. General Morrison stood before a room full of military leaders from every major nation. Old enemies sat next to each other without anger. Former rivals worked together without complaint. The destruction of Houston had burned away centuries of hatred. What remained was something simpler, something pure. They were all human. And humanity was under attack. Morrison spoke quietly, but his words carried the weight of the world. They think we are weak, he said. They think we will surrender. They think we are like every other species they have conquered. But they do not know us. They do not know what we are capable of. They do not know what we become when our backs are against the wall. He looked at the faces around him. Russian generals, Chinese admirals, European commanders, all of them listening, all of them ready. We have been fighting each other for 10,000 years, Morrison continued. We have invented 1,000 ways to kill. We have survived ice ages and plagues and wars that nearly ended our species. We are still here. We are still standing. And we will not bow to anyone. The room erupted in cheers above the earth. The Valorians prepared their next attack. They did not know that they had made the worst mistake in the history of their empire. They had made humanity angry, and humanity was just getting started. The Valorian planet killer weapons took 72 hours to charge. 72 hours before the surface of Earth would be burned clean of all life. 72 hours before every man, woman, and child would cease to exist. General Morrison received the intelligence from Dr. Katie Langston. She had intercepted the order. She had translated the specifications. She understood exactly what was coming. We have 3 days, she said. Her voice was calm, but her hands were shaking. After that, they will destroy everything. Morrison sat in silence for a long moment. He had known this might happen. He had prepared for every possible outcome. But hearing the words made it real in a way that planning never could. 3 days until the end of the world. He gathered his remaining commanders for one final meeting. The faces on the screens were tired and bloody. They had been fighting for weeks. They had lost millions of people. They had given everything they had, and it was not enough. We cannot stop them from orbit, Morrison said. We cannot shoot down their weapons. Our only chance is to call for help. The room fell silent. Everyone knew what he meant. Ben Crawford had spent the last week working on the crashed Valorian shuttle. Working beside him was Dr. Langston and a young physicist named Lauren Whitfield. Lauren was 29 years old, brilliant beyond measure, and running on nothing but coffee and determination. She had figured out how the Valorian hyperspace engines worked. She had calculated the frequencies needed to send a signal across the galaxy. The plan was simple. They would build a beacon. The beacon would broadcast a message into deep space. The message would reach the other species who had suffered under the Valorian Empire. Species who had been conquered and enslaved. Species who had been waiting for a chance to fight back. The Valorians had ruled the stars for 1,000 years by keeping their victims isolated and afraid. They made sure no conquered world could ever contact another. They crushed every rebellion before it could spread, but no one had ever thought to ask the humans for help. No one had ever imagined that a primitive species from a forgotten corner of the galaxy could hurt the Valorian Empire. Now they would know. The beacon was completed in 48 hours. It was a crude device, built from human technology and Valorian scraps, held together with welding and hope. Lauren was not even sure it would work. But it was their only chance. The problem was getting it past the Valorian blockade. 300 warships surrounded Earth. Nothing could get through without being destroyed. Nothing except a very small ship. Flown by someone willing to die. Captain Samantha Reyes volunteered before Morrison could even ask. She sat in the briefing room, looking at the maps and calculations and projections. The odds of survival were less than 1%. The Valorians would see her coming. They would try to shoot her down. She would have to fly through a storm of plasma fire, alone, with no backup and no way home. You do not have to do this, Morrison said quietly. Samantha smiled. It was a sad smile, but there was no fear in her eyes. Someone has to. I'm the best pilot you have. She was right. Everyone in the room knew she was right. The launch was scheduled for midnight. Samantha spent her last hours on Earth writing letters. One to her mother, one to her sister, one to the daughter she would never have. She sealed them in envelopes and gave them to Dr. Langston. "Make sure they know I did this for them," she said. "Make sure they know I was not afraid." At midnight, she climbed into the modified shuttle. The cockpit was cramped and hot. The controls were unfamiliar. The beacon was strapped behind her seat, humming with energy. Morrison spoke to her one last time through the radio. "The whole world is watching, Captain. We will never forget what you're doing." Samantha closed her eyes for a moment. She thought about her family. She thought about her home. She thought about every person she had ever loved. Then she opened her eyes and pushed the throttle forward. The shuttle launched from a hidden base in the mountains. It rocketed into the sky, leaving a trail of fire behind it. Within seconds, the Valorian fleet detected her. Every ship in orbit turned its weapons toward the tiny human craft. Plasma beams lit up the darkness. The sky became a hurricane of fire. Samantha flew through it all, dodging and weaving, using every trick she had learned in 20 years of flying. Her ship was hit once, twice, 3 times. Sparks flew from the control panel. Smoke filled the cockpit. Alarms screamed in her ears. She kept going. The Valorians could not believe what they were seeing. A single human in a broken ship, refusing to die. She should have been destroyed 100 times over. But she was still flying, still fighting, still pushing toward open space. One of the Valorian commanders ordered his ships to concentrate fire. Dozens of beams converged on the shuttle. There was no way she could survive, but she did not need to survive. She only needed to get far enough. Samantha activated the beacon. The signal burst out into the void, carrying a message that would echo across the galaxy. The message was simple. It contained the coordinates of Earth. It contained a description of the Valorian attack. And it contained 3 words that would change history. "We are fighting." A Valorian plasma beam struck the shuttle and tore it apart. The explosion was brief and bright against the darkness of space. Samantha Reyes had exactly 2 seconds to see the beacon, signal spreading outward before she died. Her final transmission was broadcast across every human frequency on Earth. Her voice was calm. Her words were clear. "Tell them we never gave up." Then there was silence. On the surface, billions of people watched the sky. They had seen the shuttle launch. They had followed its desperate flight. They had held their breath as it pushed through the impossible, and now they mourned. But their mourning did not last long, because within hours, something began to happen. Dr. Langston detected a signal coming from the edge of the solar system. Then another. Then a dozen more. Ships were arriving. Not Valorian ships. Different ships. Ships that carried species who had suffered under the Valorian Empire for centuries. They had heard the message. They had seen a tiny species standing against the might of the Valorians. They had watched a single pilot sacrifice herself so that her people might live. And they had decided to answer. The first fleet to arrive was from the Corvani, a species who had been enslaved for 300 years. Behind them came the Thesari, who had lost their homeworld to Valorian conquest. Then the Maxari, the Balani, the Dranathi, and a dozen others. 17 species who had been waiting for a chance to fight back. 17 species who had never had the courage to rise alone. 17 species who looked at humanity and saw something they had forgotten existed. Hope.High Commander Zoroth watched the sensor readings with growing horror. His fleet was no longer alone. His empire was no longer invincible, and the planet he had come to conquer was no longer helpless. The final battle was about to begin. The combined fleet of liberated species numbered over 1,000 ships. They emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the solar system, their weapons charged and their crews ready for battle. For centuries, they had lived under the boot of the Valorian Empire. For centuries, they had dreamed of this moment. And now, because of a tiny blue planet and a species that refused to surrender, that moment had finally come. High Commander Zoreth stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, watching the sensor readings with cold fury. His fleet was outnumbered 3-1. His soldiers on the ground were dying by the thousands. His perfect record of conquest was about to end, but he was not ready to accept defeat. Not yet. All ships, prepare for battle, he commanded. We will destroy these rebels and burn that cursed planet to ash. The Valorian fleet turned to face the approaching armada. 300 warships against 1,000. It was a battle they could not win. But the Valorians had never retreated. They had never surrendered. Their pride would not allow it. The two fleets met above Earth like thunder meeting lightning. The battle lasted 6 hours. Ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light that could be seen from the surface. Debris fell through the atmosphere like shooting stars. The darkness of space was filled with fire and death, and the screams of dying crews. On the ground, humanity watched and waited. They had done everything they could. They had fought and bled and sacrificed. Now they could only hope that it would be enough. General Morrison stood in the ruins of what had once been Washington. The city was gone, destroyed in the early days of the invasion. But the ground remained. The soil remained. And the people who had survived remained. He looked up at the sky and saw the lights of battle flickering like distant lightning. Somewhere up there, species he had never met were fighting for his planet, fighting for his people, fighting because humanity had shown them that it was possible to fight back. Captain Samantha Reyes had made this possible. Her sacrifice had lit a fire that was now spreading across the galaxy. The battle ended at dawn. The Allied fleet had lost 300 ships. The Valorians had lost everything. Not a single Valorian warship remained in Earth orbit. Their great fleet, the terror of 17 star systems, had been reduced to scattered wreckage. The ships that tried to flee were hunted down and destroyed. The ships that tried to surrender were given mercy, but only barely. High Commander Zoreth was captured trying to escape in a shuttle. His bridge crew had been killed. His flagship had been destroyed. Everything he had built in a lifetime of conquest was gone. He was brought to Earth in chains, forced to walk through the ruins of the cities his forces had destroyed. He saw the faces of the humans watching him. He expected hatred. He expected violence. He expected them to tear him apart with their bare hands. Instead, they simply watched, silent, unblinking, their eyes filled with something he did not understand. It was not hatred. It was something worse. It was pity. He was taken to what remained of the United Nations building in New York. The structure was damaged but still standing. General Morrison waited for him there, sitting behind a simple wooden table that had been salvaged from the rubble. Zoreth expected to be executed. He expected to be tortured. He expected the savage treatment that the Valorians had always given to their defeated enemies. Morrison did something else entirely. He offered the alien a chair. He placed a glass of water on the table between them. And then he spoke. "You made a mistake," Morrison said quietly. His voice was tired but calm. "You studied our population, our technology, our resources, but you never studied our history." Zoreth said nothing. He did not understand. Morrison gestured to the destroyed city around them. Through the broken windows, Zoreth could see humans already working in the streets, clearing rubble, treating the wounded, beginning to rebuild. It had been less than a day since the battle ended, and they were already starting over. "We have been fighting each other for our entire existence," Morrison continued. "We have survived ice ages that covered the planet in frost. We have survived plagues that killed half our population. We have survived wars that slaughtered hundreds of millions. Every single generation has faced something that should have destroyed us. And every single generation has refused to die." He leaned forward, and his eyes met Zorith's. "We are not brave because we do not know fear. We are brave because we have been afraid every single day of our existence, and we fight anyway. Fear does not stop us. Pain does not stop us. Death does not stop us. Nothing stops us." Dr. Katie Langston entered the room, carrying a tablet that showed the new galactic alliance forming around Earth. 17 species, united by humanity's refusal to surrender. More were joining every hour. The Valorian Empire was collapsing. Worlds that had been enslaved for centuries were rising up. The fire that Samantha Reyes had lit was spreading across the stars. Langston set the tablet on the table, where Zorith could see it. "You came here expecting sheep," she said. "You found wolves." Zorith looked at the screen. He saw the alliance growing. He saw his empire falling. He understood finally what he had done wrong. He had seen humanity's weakness, their divisions, their primitive technology, their short lives and limited resources, but he had not seen their strength, their stubbornness, their absolute, unshakable refusal to accept defeat, their ability to unite against a common enemy, their willingness to sacrifice everything for each other. He had awakened something ancient and terrible, something that had been sleeping inside humanity, waiting for the right moment to emerge. And now it was loose in the galaxy. The Valorian Empire collapsed within a year. Their conquered worlds rose up, inspired by the species that had looked extinction in the face and simply refused to accept it. The empire that had ruled the stars for 1,000 years crumbled into dust. Earth became the center of a new galactic order, not through conquest, not through fear, but through the simple, stubborn, impossible truth that humanity had demonstrated to the universe. They were not the strongest species. They were not the most advanced. They were not the most numerous, but they were human. And when you threatened their home, when you hurt their families, when you tried to wipe them from existence, they did not surrender. They did not beg. They did not break. They fought. They bled. They sacrificed. And they won. A statue was built in the center of the new Earth capital. It showed Captain Samantha Reyes, her hand reaching toward the stars, her face calm and unafraid. At the base of the statue were carved the last words she ever spoke. "Tell them we never gave up." Billions of humans passed that statue every year. They read those words. They remembered what she had done. They remembered what humanity had proven. The universe had learned a lesson. It would never forget, never attack Earth. The humans do not know how to quit.